All right, everyone. So I'm going to do some notes here. I want you to have out Bill, and I want you to be taking some notes in here. Um, and I'll tell you what you're going to want to write down. You don't have to write down every single thing. You should know who Charles Darwin is. Okay, so at least make sure you know his name and that you know a little bit about him. But this is a picture of Charles Darwin, and he was a naturalist. He was his dad wanted him to be a doctor, so he became a doctor, but he really didn't like being a doctor. So one day he decided to jump on a ship, and in exchange for paying for his way on the ship, the ship's captain said that he could be the ship's naturalist. Now back then, when they stopped at a port to eat. It wasn't like stopping and running into Quick Trip or McDonald's to be able to get food. They had to have someone on board who could tell them what they could eat, what was safe to eat, what would keep their men healthy, and what wouldn't harm them. And so that was the naturalist's job, was to be able to go on land and check to see if what was safe to eat, what they could hunt, what organisms could harm them. And so that was his whole job. But most of the time when you're on board, the naturalist really has no job. So there's lots of times to think, lots of times to read, lots of time to draw and write. And so that's kind of what was happening with Charles Darwin when he was on the Beagle, was just a lot of thinking. They stopped at a couple of places, and from there, from his observations, was born this theory of evolution. Okay. He wrote a book. His first book was called The Origin of Species. That was the big book, the big one that like kind of blew everybody's minds. And he wrote 19 other books, but Origin of Species was the one where he kind of proposed his idea of natural selection. So this is a picture of a map of the world and Charles Darwin's trip on the Beagle. They started over here on the HMS Beagle and went through to New Zealand, went around Australia, across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope of South Africa, went to South America, but then went up into Europe, back down into South America, then around Cape Horn, around the southern edge of South America, and went all the way around. Now, that is a huge journey, you can imagine, back in the day. And one of the things that is synonymous with Charles Darwin is the Galapagos Islands. And over here is where the Galapagos Islands is, off the coast of South America. And a lot of his observations came when he was at the Galapagos Islands. He really kind of had already started thinking about this idea of natural selection. And then when he got to the Galapagos Islands, it really kind of came together. He had this huge body of evidence that he was able to collect. I mean, he literally took home bodies and bodies and bodies of birds. He took them, he killed them and preserved them, and some of them are in a museum literally to this day because he preserved them so well, and they're under glass, and they're the actual birds that Charles Darwin brought home from the Galapagos Islands. But all of this evidence came to be part of his theory, in support of his theory. So what did he observe? Well, he observed a lot of things, but the biggest things that struck his attention was the patterns of diversity, how so many plants and animals seem similar, and they had traits that were really well suited for their environment. You know, unique things that meant that organism was only able to live in that environment. Well, how was that organism able to, how did it get there to be perfectly suited to its environment and not somewhere else? That's the kind of questions he started asking himself and was trying to figure out. The Galapagos Islands are volcanic islands, and because volcanic ash and lava is so good at preserving fossils, he found a lot of fossils on the Galapagos Islands, and he was able to compare fossils with organisms he knew of today. And he was able to find fossils that look like this, but then animals that look like this, and they look very, very similar. And so he was able to kind of look at those and kind of add that to his body, this body of evidence that was growing, that was helping him. In fossils, we already looked at fossils, but you know that those are either like the preserved remains or imprint of the leftover remains of an organism. So the Galapagos Islands, it's a chain off the west coast of South America. Each island has a very different climate and a different assortment of plants and animals. And what's really weird about the Galapagos Islands is that they are pretty close together. If you look at this picture here, I mean, look at that tiny dot that is the Galapagos Island. You wouldn't imagine that anything would be different. You would imagine that all of the weather there within those islands are all going to be the same, but it's not. They have what's called microclimates. And so this island here is very different than the climate on this island, which is very different from the climate on this island. And because of that, each of the islands have developed a different set of animals and plants, and they're very unique and different from one another. They're isolated and they have limited resources. Not a lot of traffic going in and out. Not a lot of, it's not like a thoroughfare, go through the Galapagos Islands to get to anywhere else. So this basically creates this microclimate or this microenvironment for these species to survive in. Many of the animals and plants varied noticeably among the different islands. So they ping-ponged around the Galapagos for a little bit and went to many of the different islands, and he would look at birds on one island and he'd see birds on another island, but they were different from the birds on the first island. They were similar, but they were still different, and their differences made them better able to survive on the different island. And so he started thinking like, okay, how did this happen? How did this bird get here and it's better for this island while the other bird is better for the other island? How did that happen? Other species that he looked at were the tortoises, the giant land tortoises that are so big and huge. This guy's probably close to, he's probably well over 100 years old. He also noticed finches. That's what he's most famous for. And then his marine iguanas. Excuse me. They had, each of the islands of the Galapagos had marine iguanas, but they were all very, very different. So if we look at land tortoises, this one, these are all the ones that are on the different islands. So this saddleback shelled tortoise, it lives on Hood Island. This Isabella Island tortoise has a dome-shaped shell. And then this one that lives on the Pinta Island has a sort of intermediate shell. It's not flat, it's not domed, it's just kind of intermediate. The other thing that you can notice is how long their necks are and how they vary depending on the different item or different vegetation that they're eating out of. Okay, so on Hood, you can imagine with this guy's neck being so long, it's probably because the food that he's eating is higher up, and that's why the ones that survived best on Hood Island were ones that had a longer neck, and all the rest died out. And the ones with bigger necks survived, had babies, and they made ones that also had larger necks. Okay, so a couple of different differences based on where they are. So they were all similar, but their specific traits made them better suited for their particular environment. If we look at the iguanas, no other marine iguanas exist anywhere in the world other than the Galapagos Islands. And by marine means seawater. Okay, so no other saltwater iguanas live anywhere else in the world. They're all freshwater. So where did they come from? So the idea was that maybe a land iguana drifted to the Galapagos either on bark or on driftwood or maybe on a ship or some other way drifted to the Galapagos Islands, and then finding no food on land, decided to go to the sea, see if he could find something in the water. He was starving, he couldn't find anything to eat in the land, so well, let's try the sea. So he decided to try that, and then the ones that had better ability to survive, who could swim better, those ones were able to eat the most food, and they were healthy enough to have babies, and then their babies were better swimmers, and so on and so forth, right? The ones that couldn't swim, well, they just died because they couldn't get any food. What's important to know, guys, is that no one iguana learned to swim. No one iguana went from being a terrible swimmer to a good swimmer. It was a trait that was either, it had to already be in the population. There was just some that were good swimmers. Those ones ate more. They survived. They had babies. And because it was a genetic trait that can be inherited, then most of their children also were good swimmers because they inherited that from their parents. And then eventually, over time, the species evolved to be more good swimmers. Okay, so when we say that an animal adapts, we're talking about the species adapting over long periods of time, and it takes either a mutation or some random variation that makes them better suited for their environment. Okay, so if we look at finches here for a minute, Darwin observed that there were many species of finches on the different islands. Each of them were well suited to their island, which they were living in. Now, this is just some of the species of finches. You can really just get into finches, and there's like hundreds of them that he was able to start classifying and preserving and bringing back. This is a classic example of speciation. Now, what was speciation? Speciation was whenever you have a species that's similar and they get separated somehow, either geographically or they can't mate. Some way or another, they're isolated, okay? And in this case, in the case of the Galapagos Islands, they were isolated on the different islands. And so they only mated with each other. They didn't mate with the organisms on the other islands. And so over time, the ones on that particular island that were better suited for that island, those ones survived better. They had babies, and they ended up becoming a different species because over long periods of times, they got less and less similar to the species where they originally separated. Okay, so it's a whole process where a new species eventually arises, where maybe all of them at one point had some common ancestor on the mainland before these islands broke off from the mainland. Okay. All right, so this is kind of the idea of founder effect. This is when you have changes in allele frequency. Now, allele frequency, this is not a word you have to know right away. You're going to learn it when we get to genetics. But allele means gene, okay? Just think of it as a gene. And frequency means how many times you see it, okay? Changes in gene frequency as a result of the migration of a small subgroup of a population. So you have this original population here, and you take a small piece of it, okay, and you move it. Say these ones get blown from one island to a different island, okay, and now this different island has different kind of characteristics. It has different traits. Maybe it has more dry weather, and all of a sudden, instead of being this species that is pretty much 50-50 red-green, well, maybe the green ones are, what just happened? Maybe the green ones are just really bad at living in dry temperatures. So the green ones start dying out, right? The green ones die out. The red ones have babies. Now the red ones, when they have babies, some of them are going to be green, but most of them are going to be red, like how you're kind of like your parents, but sometimes not, right? So eventually what starts happening is that the green ones keep dying out, and then the ones that survive to reproduce are the red ones, so that eventually you have a population now that is 100% red instead of 50-50, just because of the fact that that population was taken to an island that had different characteristics. Okay. All right, I think we're going to end there for now.